Okay, so I'm going to kick off the questions. We will have time at the end for some audience questions. And this really is an open question to anyone on the panel. So conversations about screen time feel very divided. They're very black and white. We've lost a lot of room for nuance, I think. Screens are bad, or screens are unavoidable, or screens, we can't get rid of them. So how do we have a more balanced, evidence-informed conversation that recognizes both concerns and benefits? Dr. Madigan.
Thanks. So from the research, we know that the impacts on screens, it is nuanced. We focus a lot about the time kids spend on screens. That's really important. Big portion of the research is around, we call it a dose-response relationship. So how much time are you spending on screens, and how is that, as the time mounts, how does that relate to kids' outcome? What we generally know from synthesizing all the research that's been done on this topic for years is that there is a signal there. So the more time kids spend on screens, they have more struggles in learning, in their sleep, in their academic functioning. But child development is a little bit like a puzzle piece, and there are a lot of things that can contribute to kids struggling in these areas, and screen time is one piece of the puzzle. And I'm glad we're talking about it today, but there are a lot of other factors that I'm sure we'll get into. And we often, when we think about screen time and what the research is saying, it's important to think about how often kids are on screens, but it's equally important to think about what they're doing on screens and what they're engaging with on screens, because those are actually really important facets of determining whether screens are risky or beneficial. And I'll give one example from our research. So we know that the longer that kids are on screens, the poorer their language development. But actually, if they're watching educational programming or they're co-viewing screens with the caregiver, so they're doing the family night, movie night, we actually see a benefit to their language development. So they get a little bolstering from screens in terms of their language when the content is positive and when they're engaging in the screen time with a caregiver, for example, who's presumably scaffolding a little bit about what's going on the screen. That said, they get 3 times more in terms of their language development strengths through parent-child face-to-face interactions than they do from an educational program. So there's a lot to think about with this. You can talk about long doses being not great for kids, but when screens are used in the right ways with the right people, kids get a little benefit from that. But it's not the same benefit that they get from those really rich face-to-face interactions where there's this back and forth serve and return between caregivers and kiddos.
Maybe I'll just jump in and add something else. I think the language that we use or how we talk about online, the digital world and that our kids are living in can often inflame this. And so one recent example of this, Canada's Minister of AI, Evan Solomon, was here in Banff at an AI conference. He's our minister, the federal leader for AI, and he described AI right now as, it's either the people with the pom-poms or the pitchforks. Now, I realize, Evan has had a career in media as a journalist and broadcaster. He's mastered the soundbite. But, when you have somebody whose main job it is to govern the AI landscape in Canada, talking about it as the pitchforks or the pom-poms, that really doesn't help us. It's really, it creates this, I think it sets people up into 2 camps, and it's possible to live somewhere in the middle of this, to recognize that AI is a reality that our kids are growing up with. It's disrupting their education. It's both supporting and also disrupting their education. It's it has real risks around the mental health supports, being used as a companion and all of these issues. It's disrupting their future workforce and the jobs that they will be able to move into in the very near future. And so I think when we are talking about these issues, it's really important to choose our language carefully. Those of us who do media or public speaking, we understand that we need to have little sound bites, but we need to be careful that we're not setting this up as this either-or situation, to recognize both the positives that can come with digital technology, but also the real risks, and to try and have informed discussions that really support our children, and to invite kids into that conversation. what it was like for me, a kid growing up in the 80s is very different than it is for my 15-year-old. He is often far further ahead in his technology skills than I am. And I think for us as adults to also embrace the fact that we can come at this with a place of curiosity when we don't know, to ask our kids to teach us some of these things. Often my son is teaching me these things or talking about trends that I haven't heard of. I'm an educated, informed, and engaged parent, but there's often, I think, a real space to be learning alongside our children, and to admit we don't know certain things, and to help them, I think, to learn together, to sort of be in this learning journey with children, whether it's in our homes or in the classrooms or in the organizations that serve and support children.
And I feel that divided conversation actually often happen in the macro level when we're talking about like public health policy making, where we need this clear signals to the family, to a caregiver, just like whether schools should ban phones, yes or no, right? We need that clear message. And in this case, is how much screen time is too much, how much time is acceptable. So, but that we kind of, is based on some generalized pattern that we do observe, like see that in our research, but that is across large population, I want to say. So kind of take the average and aggregate all the children in the sample. Well, we have the results that apply to most kids, but not everyone. So I feel like the conversation, when we really zoom in and focus on every individual child in a particular context, then it just naturally become less divided and more nuanced, because every child is so different from each other and also from themselves and different time point, because they grow and develop so fast. The children's personality, temperament, their predisposition also play a big role here, right? Because not every child responds to those screens the same way, and so that they are not impacted the same way. I think Sheri mentioned that, like watching a good episode of educational high quality TV is totally different from watching a flashing cartoon that is, just designed mostly for attention grabbing. And the children are, develop and change rapidly. Their development levels have the role, even a very well designed screen media can benefit 4 years old, for example, may not work for 2 years old at all. So, and also in what context, and I think all that nitty gritties in real life matters and make every cases different. We can have very divided white and black answer for.
Did you want to add anything?
Sure, I can just add a bit. I mean, you've heard me speak for a while already, but I definitely recognize the importance of having a balanced conversation. I think that is the goal. I think, though, that what I see in reality is that we don't have balanced use of tech time and screen time right now. We have a very skewed use of screen time. Kids are on it so much, and parents are on it so much. Parents are on their phones 4 hours a day for entertainment-based purposes only, 2.5 hours on social media. So I feel like, in a way, it is a time for a moral panic. This is a crisis that we're talking about. And yes, we can get to the point where we can have more balanced conversations about it, but we have to get back to that point where people and children are doing other things with their time. They're not spending every single free minute scrolling on their phones outside of school and during school as well, if we're being honest. So we have to give kids back, give them back their lives, a chance at doing other things and developing other interests. And at that point, I hope that we can attain that balanced use. That is the goal, but it's quite far from our reality right now.
Thank you all for that. I'm just going to ask a few questions about research and child development. Sheri, I'll start with you. Sheri, your research has really looked at the relations between screen time and child developmental outcomes. Can you tell us a bit more about what Canadian research tells us about when and how screen use impacts early childhood?
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier that we tend to see that kids, the more they're on screens, we see that there's impacts on their thinking, their academics, their language learning. They have reduced sleep. They have reduced physical activity. So we often think of screen time as one piece of the developmental puzzle. But what you heard about today already, and what is really playing out in reality, is it's also just that screen time is displacing a lot of these other really important pieces of that puzzle. So the piece of screen time seems to be getting bigger and bigger in that overall space of of what makes up that child's developmental day, and it's taking over the space of the things we really want them to do because it's so important for their development, like sleep, physical activity, get some academics in, and actually have like nice meals with their family and engage with their caregivers. These are really important aspects of their development. And with kiddos who are older, we want them to engage in their peer development because that's really important for them as well. So we know that screens creeping in and crowding out other really important activities in kids' lives. And that is certainly, I think, a concern that you're going to hear from all of us. What we know from the research is it's nuanced in terms of what they're doing on screens and who they're engaging in screens with. And I'll give you a few more examples like I did earlier. We know for gaming, for example, and boys tend to be on video games more, we don't seem to see the same level of impact on gaming in terms of some of kids, for example, their academics, if they're engaging in gaming with their friends. So if you have a teenage boy, I do, he's on his phone, they're gaming, they're cooperating, they're trying to figure out how to get to the next level or, to, I don't know, give someone something like I don't know, does anyone know the right word? It's like they're giving them some apparatus that helps them get to, and they give it to them, and then the other one gets something, and I can hear him, and they're actually having a great dialogue together, and they're cooperating to get to the next phase of this game. I see that as actually a really positive use of screen time, and a great way for them to engage in problem solving. And maybe that's one of the reasons we're not seeing the same effects of video games on some outcomes than social media, for example, in kids, where they're starting to compare how they look to who's on these screens, where they're getting these quick shots of attention-grabbing moments, and then they're on to the next one. So once we get into the older kids and they tend to really diversify the types of screens that they're on, it's getting a lot harder for us researchers to know if time matters because it's less about the time and more what they're doing on screens and who they're doing it with. So you can think about it a little bit like the research on screen times like nutrition. So if we just counted our calories in a day, and that's all we did, it doesn't really tell us about what we ate, when we ate, and who we ate with. And all of those things also really matter for our nutritional benefit. And screen time is a little bit the same way, especially in the older kids when they start to really diversify how they engage with screens. So the amount matters, but so too does how they're engaging with it. And I think we, as parents, have to have conversations with them, not just how long they're on screens, what they're doing on screens, who they're doing that with, and it's part of a larger conversation around monitoring and modeling and being supportive around it.
Great, thank you. Moan, from a learning science perspective, how can educators integrate digital learning in ways that complement important developmental skills like play, reading, social interaction, and hands-on exploration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to have a disclosure that I'm mostly working with very young children, so toddlers, preschoolers, mostly before they enter, formal schooling. So that's probably where my perspective and like this I share comes from. So I think from learning science perspective, actually I really like how this question is framed. I think because especially complement, I think here is the right word to use, because I totally agree digital media technology are in no place to compete with reading, play, real-world hands exploration. They shouldn't. But we also know what they can do and what they can help is to complement and extend those experiences in some situations. And we have growing evidence showing that sometimes they can be pretty valuable tools to support their learning across multiple development domains when used properly. So the big question is how. So here I'd like to share maybe like three ideas that have been seen, to be pretty effectively by academic research. So the first one for educators is to use them intentionally with clear learning goals. So we should ask first, what I want the children to learn today, and then what my learning approach would be, and then evaluate if digital media or screens can, support that, and if so, we select the right tools for that. So different pedagogies, direct instruction, guided play, inquiry, they can all call different, platforms and affordance, right? And the second one I would say is to take advantage of this technology for what they are good at. Here, example for those how they can kind of be more useful, I think is in the science domain, especially for young children. They, because why the reason is because they can visualize some of the invisible processes and abstract concepts often involved in science. For example, how seeds grow underground, how blood circulate, right? How let's say how gravity works, like those forces acting, those things abstract, especially for young children, they can better visualize for them to have a grasp about. And also something that really hard or even impossible for children to explore and interact with physically in the real world, like mixing chemicals, for example. Those kind of STEM games could be helpful when used intentionally and properly. So the last one I would say is for educators, or even I think more general in caregivers, when involving children with this, to make this connection for them between the digital world and the real world. Because the science is super clear here that especially for young children, very difficult for them to use what they see and what they learn from the screen or digital media to apply that to real world, to solve a real world problem. They can, for example, pick up a word from vocabulary learning app, but they struggle to use that in the real conversation, in the real book reading, especially when there are a lot of cognitive capacity are still underdeveloped. So it's on us to make this connection for them, to explicitly point how they relate, what's the relationship. Example would be, look, this is a cat in the show, right? You have a cat at home as well. How they different, how they're similar with each other. Oh, they both meow, but yours have a different coat color. So, but they are both cats. Look, this one is chasing a bar of yarn. Does your cat do the same thing? So something like this kind of conversation really help your children to compare, to reason and think, kind of pull our thinking from just on the screen and those all perceptual things could be particularly helpful. Yeah, I think that's what I want to share.
That's great. Thank you so much. Catherine, in your keynote, you mentioned 4 really key helpful hints for parents, or helpful tips to sort of, reduce their child's screen time, to put boundaries around it. And you have that wonderful metaphor of the pilot returning to base. So if you're a parent of a 15-year-old who has a phone, hasn't had any limits, could you expand on some of those tips and think about how a parent might return to base,
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm asking you the impossible, but I think it's something I've been wondering about.
Yeah, so a 15-year-old who's had no limits. I guess the question is, are you as the parent unhappy with how the situation is? Because I'm not telling you have to go home and do something differently if you are fine for whatever reason. I don't presume to tell other people how to parent you. If you are upset about how things are, feeling uncomfortable with your child's relationship with technology, then by all means, you do need to revisit that. So this is assuming that you do want to make change in your home. Well, I would start by talking to your kid, first of all. Like your child at 15 is a pretty self-aware, independent person on the verge of adulthood. Ask them how their relationship feels with their phone. Flip the script a bit. Start asking them about how their friends' relationships are going. Have them starting to tell you, those horror stories. Believe me, my kids can tell me horror stories about their own classmates and things that they're dealing with online, to try to just create a bit more perspective. And start asking them, and so I do this when I'm in high schools giving talks. I ask students to tell me what they feel like they're not, what they're missing out on, what things they wish they could do with their time and with their lives if they didn't have a phone, and every hand goes up. And there's so many things that these kids are saying. And so as a parent, use that as sort of ammunition to reinforce your own step forward here. So then I would create some limits. I'd tell your kid, we're going to revisit these rules. We need to create a bit more structure. You can say, I'm sorry that I didn't do this sooner. I should have. And I know it's not going to be easy. I did show you those scripts as well. But so I would start with a few basic things. So I would start with not letting them take the phone in their room at night. Keep it in a common area of the home. I think that that's incredibly important. If they're using social media, which they probably are, ensure that you have access, that you can sometimes, and tell them that you are. You're not sneaking in and snooping around without their permission, but see what they're doing online. If it's a real problem, you could have them delete their profiles. There are some great steps on that abstinence.org website that I mentioned for deactivating and deleting a social media profile, and just saying we're gonna hit pause. We're gonna give it 6 months. We're gonna give it another year. Really, any time is a win at this age. Just tell them we're gonna come back to it in another year's time, and then you can, continue. But right now, you need to be off of it. One idea is to delete the apps from their phone so that they may still keep a social media presence on a desktop computer, and have them log in maybe only once a day. You could have them have a passive role only where they're not allowed to post anything. They can sort of lurk in the background and see what their friends are doing if it's really important to keep their finger on the pulse of what's happening socially, but they're not contributing to the conversation. These are all different limits and different layers that you could choose to do. If you have a kid who's a gamer, Dr. Madigan's right. We don't see as nearly negative effects from gaming as we do on social media, which is a good thing. But that's, I think, up to about, 2 hours a day or something. And then past that point, it definitely is problematic use. So if you have, usually it's boys who tend to gravitate more to the gaming world, so I would pay attention to that. Make sure, again, they're doing it in a common area of the home. Don't let those consoles be in their bedrooms where you cannot keep an eye out on what they're doing, who they're playing with, and how many hours of the night they are playing, because they'll probably be doing that as well. And then I'd have them model, as a parent, you need to be modeling good behaviors, showing your child how to handle their phone in a really responsible way, and doing things with them. So filling that void, like I mentioned. That 15-year-old, why are they on their phone for so many hours? Do they have hobbies? Can you sign them up for teams or clubs or sports? Can you give them more responsibility around the home? Can you have them make dinner a couple nights a week? Help out with the grocery shopping. Give them some more chores. I'm a big fan of giving, training those practical life skills to help fill the time that would be left when they're not on their devices. So those are just a few suggestions. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that, they're really great suggestions. One of the things that we've recommended in the new guidelines for the American Academy of Pediatrics around the screen time is to think about it around, like, you could present a pie to kids and you could talk through, especially the older kids who have the kind of capacity to have these conversations with you, and they also have the amount of hours they're on screen time on their phone, so you can use that to your advantage. But you say, how do you want your day to look? Think of this pie as 24 hours of your time. Okay, you're sleeping for what should be 10 hours of that. All right, that gives you 14 hours left. You're at that for 8 of those hours you're at school. All right, now we've got this chunk left. How do you want to divide up that time? And when you start to work with the teens, especially, because you asked about a 15-year-old, or you spoke about a 15-year-old, give them agency to talk about what they want that little division of time to look like. And when you point out that right now, most of that leftover time is actually screen time, how's that working for them? How would they like that to look differently? When I've done this with kids or done this clinically, with patients, is people will say, well, I want to make sure I get some homework in, and I like connecting with my friends, and okay, I want this time. Well, I also have volleyball, or I have whatever sport they're in. And when they actually start to divide maybe the 4 hours of time they have in a day for how they want their space and time to sort of unfold, it gives them a real powerful sort of visual of what they're doing with their time and how much screen time is crowding out all these other really important activities to them. So that's something I've done both clinically and with my own kids, is just, here's the pie, let's talk through it, and then revisiting. I really believe in sticking with something and revisiting it and say, how's that pie chart going a week later, and seeing if they're able to achieve that, and then readjusting goals with them here and there, keeping firm limits, but I think we also have to learn to compromise with them and help them get through their day.
Thank you both. Those are great. Katherine, what have you seen communities do well to support parents and families with reducing screen time?
Yeah, I visited Central Valley, New York, which is just outside of New York City, a couple months ago. I did a talk at that high school, and that high school has, I went to several high schools. This one was in Poughkeepsie, also in New York, and they got rid of phones in the schools there. And they created a phone booth in the office. It was inspired by British red phone booths. And they recognized that kids are used to calling their parents from school all the time. But now that they couldn't, they needed to create an alternative way for kids to be able to communicate and make pickup plans. And the principal told me that the lineup to use this phone booth is amazing. Like all the kids line up just because they love the phone booth. It's very cool. And so I just thought that was such an interesting workaround. Like they obviously recognize this need and this habit that needs to be changed, but they're trying to kind of meet the students where they're at in a way that doesn't compromise the new rules and standards for the school in terms of limiting smartphones in class. So I thought that was just one example of kind of, a cool, innovative solution to a problem. And then that same principal told me about how at their pep rally, he was considering letting the kids bring their phones, but then he decided no, he wouldn't do that, but he would designate several kids to be the official photographers for the event. So he gave out digital cameras to about 5 or 6 kids who took photos of the pep rally all day and uploaded all the photos to a Google Drive, which was then shared with all the students. So they still got pictures from the pep rally, but no one was distracted by their phones. And he said that that was probably the best pep rally they've had in all the years that it had been running since kids had phones. So the parents in that school are feeling incredibly well supported by the principals and the district's decision to restrict phones and come up with these alternatives that still meet the kids kind of where they're at. I thought that was one cool example of a community rallying behind this effort to curb screen time. One other thing I've been thinking about a lot is creating third spaces for teenagers in particular. Teens still need playgrounds. And right now, our infrastructure in our cities is very much limited to little kids. You've got splash pads and playgrounds, but past the age of like 10, what is a kid supposed to do? Like there's really so little. And I think that that's a huge gap in this conversation because you can tell the kids to get off the screens, but unless there's a place for them to go, you can't. Like there's just nothing for them to do. And not every city has an incredible library like this, which is absolutely spectacular. So there was a great series in Bloomberg written by Alexandra Lang, an architecture writer. She won the Pulitzer Prize for it, actually. But it was on swing sets and designing outdoor play spaces for teenagers and how teens should be our target audience in all of our play spaces because that's going to also draw little kids. It's going to draw adults. It's just going to be a wonderful solution. So she listed a whole bunch of different cities in the U.S. that have built these playgrounds that draw teens. And I think that that is what I want to see in more communities across Canada.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion and a really interesting example. And it leads us really nicely to my next questions for Sara about system level contributions. So what responsibilities do systems have, Sara, from your perspective in building healthy digital environments?
A huge, huge role. We've had this experiment now for 20 plus years of trusting the tech industry to do the right thing. And they have clearly proven themselves untrustworthy. We've had the recent decisions against Meta and Google/YouTube, holding them accountable for grave, grave harms. There is no other product that is marketed to children and youth or available in public society, in society that doesn't go through some form of regulation. The food our kids eat, the medicine they take, the playgrounds they play in, the schools they attend, the cars they ride in, all of these things are regulated. There are safety standards that are enforced. And if one of those products makes our kids sick, puts them in the emergency room, or worse, causes a death, those products are recalled. This is a product safety issue that we accept in every other aspect, and not only expect demand for every other aspect of a child's life, but we've had these products on the market causing grave, grave harms, causing our kids to be gravely ill, mentally ill, self-harming, too many deaths of teens by suicide. I speak with parents. I've become friends with Carol Todd, the mother of Amanda Todd, who was the first Canadian teen to die from suicide because of cyberbullying and cyber exploitation. And she's been at this for over a decade now, advocating here in Canada and globally. And it is just honestly ludicrous to me that the government, has called Carol to the Hill time after time to testify to countless studies and hearings. Earlier this year in February, Carol and I were testifying to a Heritage Committee study by Parliament. The Heritage Committee was studying the impacts of social media on children. And my message to them was, we don't need more studies. We have, as Jonathan Hayta said, we have mountains of evidence that social media is harming our children. We don't need more evidence. I'm not just in any way dismissing the need for further academic study. Of course we need ongoing study about these issues, but we know that these products are harming our children. We can't trust these companies to do the right thing, and we need to regulate it. So there is a big push, right now for online safety legislation. Katherine referenced this earlier. Australia has made huge global headlines for their social media ban or age restrictions. But a lot of things, something most Canadians don't realize is that before that happened, Australia already had an Online Safety Act in place. They had an e-digital safety commissioner, an independent watchdog that was holding companies accountable. In Canada, we have nothing, absolutely nothing protecting our kids in the digital age. And so Children First Canada is leading the charge along with many other organizations to get an Online Safety Act tabled and passed. It's been almost 1,700 days since the Liberal Party pledged to do this back in 2021. So we're counting the days. If you go to countdownforkids.ca, we're counting the days since this promise was made to children and parents. And we'll be on Parliament Hill next week on Monday, bringing children and youth and parents, educators and allies to the Hill to rally and just demand that every member of Parliament and our Prime Minister get their act together. Kids, we have a program called the Young Canadians Parliament. These kids learn about their rights, they learn about their responsibilities, but they want to use technology. They recognize it's a part of their daily lives and their future, but they expect the adults to do the right thing. They expect their parents to set rules for their households. They expect their educators to be informed and to be equipping them with skills, but they also expect their policymakers to create a legislative environment that protects them and that respects their rights as digital citizens. And so, it's not the be-all and end-all. A social media age ban or age restrictions will not solve all our problems. The Online Safety Act will not solve all our problems. We know from countries like Australia and the EU and the UK that have this legislation that there are still huge problems to be, but this is one important layer of protection that is critical. So I think one message I want to share with everybody here is I think there's a sense of overwhelm and this problem is so big, I can't solve it. But we all have power, whether it's some of the great examples Katherine has shared, or everyone's shared about what you can do in your home or what you can do in your classroom. But we are also citizens, and we have elected representatives, and must be use your voice to contact your local member of Parliament and to contact the Prime Minister and demand this for our children and ask your kids. And we've got on Monday we'll be delivering 300 letters from school children, 12 and 13-year-olds who wrote the most beautiful and simple yet powerful letters to our Prime Minister and members of Parliament, demanding that this happen. It's way past time for us to have this legislation in place. And so maybe you've never advocated before. Maybe your only civic duty has been voting, but this is the time and the moment to use your voice to engage elected officials. And so I plead with you, on the countdownforkids.ca, you can sign this petition, add your voice to the growing chorus of Canadians demanding the Online Safety Act get passed and tabled, and that this be supported unanimously. I think we live in a very divisive and hyper-partisan world right now, but if there's something that every member of Parliament and every Canadian should be able to agree on, it's the protection of our children in this digital age.
Thank you very much, and thanks for sharing those ways to advocate. Could you tell us just a bit more about what you would see or what should be tabled in that Online Safety Act, just for people?
Yeah, we don't have to start from scratch. There are many countries. Canada's dangerously behind other jurisdictions. So the core elements of an Online Safety Act is the duty of care, for these companies to prevent foreseeable harms. We know that Meta and Google and Snapchat and all these companies have all kinds of evidence that their products are harming our children. So this duty to prevent foreseeable harms, like the addictive features, like the promotion of, how the algorithm is driving harmful content to children, they should have a duty to prevent foreseeable harms. The second key piece of this is to have safety by design. Again, not radical idea that any other product that is made available to children and youth should be designed with the safety of our children at the core of it, and to prioritize that safety. We've seen clearly from the recent decisions against Meta and YouTube that they knew that these things were endangering kids and putting them at risk, and so that safety by design is critical. And the third key pillar of this is to have an independent regulator. We can't trust these companies to do the right thing. They need to have a watchdog holding them to account, like Australia has with their Digital Safety Commissioner, who can investigate, who can issue harsh penalties and hold them to account. Another last but not certainly least, is to involve children in this process. I think if we know from policymaking that if we involve children, the intended beneficiaries of policies in conversations about these issues, that we're going to have better outcome, more meaningful laws, more meaningful buy-in from young people. And so that's really what we want in this whole conversation, is for government to be speaking with children. That's why we continue to bring them to the Hill to meet with on Monday with Minister Mark Miller and with other MPs, because these parliamentarians need to hear that children expect them to work with them as partners to implement this legislation. And I think one other piece of this is, I've been talking more federally, but there's important things that can happen here in our province of Alberta. Alberta currently has no regulation when it comes to AI. And we know AI is creeping its way into all the classrooms from the early years all the way into high school. And I'm not, as I said earlier, not denying that AI has a role to play in kids' lives now and in the future, but at the present time, when there is absolutely no product safety, when there is no protection of the digital privacy, let alone, we've seen huge escalations of harm in the digital world, in AI in particular, around AI being used to create child sexual abuse materials. Just a few months ago, a 17-year-old boy was arrested here in Calgary for having created AI sexual abuse content involving five other girls in the city. That's one, grave example of harm. But also, Tumbler Ridge is just a really recent tragedy that is on every parent's mind, of how AI is escalating harms. And so we need our province of Alberta to regulate AI, particularly within the classroom setting, and set some clear parameters around that. That's another example of how the province can play a role in creating a safer digital environment for our kids.
And to that very quickly, I think it's just a concrete example from the early childhood world. We also see that, I think, we are saying, and our research found that educational media are good, right? But the thing is, this gap between the research and the real world is parents often don't know which content are good, and even the preschool, like teachers, educators, they don't know. And a lot of times, there are reports show that those labeled as educational online by those tech companies, they are not accurate at all. So then what actually we should give this in the front end is never, I think, is clear in this stage at least. So we are parents and caregivers and educators are kind of in the middle, and they are hearing this evidence-based guidelines, and sometimes they don't have much practical information to actually use that kind of evidence to support their day-to-day choice. So yeah.
Thank you. So this is for all of you. So if we put children's health, mental well-being, and development, and of course literacy, because many of us here are deeply passionate about literacy, at the center of all of our decisions, what concrete changes at home and classrooms and communities and at the policy levels can we advocate for right now? We've covered a lot of that, but are there more?
I guess
I know you all have brilliant ideas. Sorry, Sheri.
One of the things with the new screen time guidelines, so they were last published in 2016, and what we really focused on in the most recent iteration of those, it used to be just on like, what can we do as parents? Parents, limit screen time, monitor. And many parents are saying, I'm trying my best. This is really hard. I am a parent of 4 kids that range from 9 to 17. It's really interesting in our house trying to navigate screen time. They issue protests in my house. They make cards, they make signs, they come in and they say, we want screens. I mean, they got it on video. It's one of my favorite videos to watch as a screen time researcher, because I think, they had to get creative about trying to get screen time. It's great. It's really difficult, and about 50% of parents are saying screen time is one of their top parenting concerns. So we're all sort of in this together, and it's hard. And I think we can give advice and make suggestions while also recognizing this is a really difficult component of parenting, and we're up against algorithms that keep kids on screens, nudges, autoplay, and that's where these system level changes are so important. So when we wrote the screen time guidelines, we didn't just talk about what parents could do, we talked about what schools could do, what policy could do, and that's sort of how we all, I think, need to be having this conversation around how can we each contribute towards creating a change here where we're going in the positive direction around digital media. And I want to echo what Sara said, because if you've ever thought about getting involved, now is the time for all of the work that you're doing and your group's doing, but also Canada. I think for the first time, I'm feeling a bit more optimistic. The minister signaled last week that they're thinking about putting a social media ban on and an AI ban on, and that to signal that, I think, in the news is positive, and we can get behind that by talking to your, folks in your community, trying to create some advocacy level changes. I think now is the time for that. The effect that I believe that has is starting a conversation. So Australia's social media ban has started a really important conversation, and it's also empowered a lot of parents, I think, to make a decision to put limits on their own kids' bans. So it's not just what we do as parents, but when a government makes a decision, it makes us as parents talk about it, and it makes us feel empowered to make the same decisions, whether there's a policy or not within our own country. And so when we think about, what can we do at home, in the classroom, in communities, at the policy level, we can work together. And I think if we do that, we'll make a much more healthy digital environment for our kiddos.
I think one thing to add on just the systems level change, I think it's not lost on me that we talk about this, the need for social change. And we are for sure in a moment where I'm really optimistic that we will get legislation tabled soon, not just for social media age restrictions or restricting AI chatbots, but also this Online Safety Act. The government keeps saying that they're going to table this spring, hopefully by June, but they keep giving caveats that maybe we need more time. We need time to get this right. And my message to them is, to your point earlier, Katherine, this is a crisis. This is a full-blown crisis. The house is on fire. Get on with it, people. You've been studying this issue for years. We know what works in other countries. We know what doesn't work. Let's not dwindle on this any longer. It's time to get this done. And so the sense of urgency, to email, certainly sign the petition that we've got. There's postcards up on our table, the Children First table up there, where you can grab a postcard to learn more and sign the petition. But call your MP's office, email them, tag them on social media. Just go at this. We're in this real push, and we have to treat this as the crisis that it is, because not a single day goes by when I don't open the news and read about yet another tragedy, kids being hospitalized, or suicide issues, or school shootings. We could just go on and on. It's a daily deluge of harms, and for parents to think that it couldn't happen to your child, it's I don't know if it's willful blindness. I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but we cannot afford to think that this couldn't happen to your child, because every parent that I've spoken with who has lost a child, or who has had a child harm, thought it couldn't be them. These were engaged, educated, informed parents, and it happened to their children, and it could happen to yours. I don't mean to create this sort of anxious fear. I think it's a sense of empowerment that we can set rules in our household, but we can also hold our leaders to account.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that what I would like to see is more of an attitude of techno-selectionism, where we become choosier about the technology that we use. So basically, technology has to prove its utility and its value to our children and to our own lives before we allow it to enter and take over our lives. Right now we live in a technophilic society where anything that is new and exciting and shiny and capable is seen as a sign of progress and something that must be adopted and used until suddenly it shows that it's not working quite as well for us, and it's a lot harder to walk it back. So I think that would just be a healthier outlook to have. Make sure that things really are beneficial to our children before we incorporate it into their lives. And as for what to do at home, of course, I've talked about that quite a bit, but to emphasize that I just don't think that screens should be part of our young children's lives as a form of entertainment, really, at all. I mean, try to give them the first 10 years without much of it at all. The occasional movie here and there, but that's not too much to ask. That's only 10 years out of their entire life That's an opportunity to give them their imaginations and free play and lots of sleep and conversation and curiosity and daydreaming and all of this beautiful, wonderful stuff that kids deserve to have in their lives. After the age of 10, maybe you start to ease into certain tech, like a bit more educational stuff. They're going to need it for school, some research, teach them how to research things, and hold out on that smartphone, social media, until at least 16, maybe social media till 18. Dr. Jean Twenge even says that kids shouldn't even have it in high school at all. So delay, delay, delay. It will not hurt to delay as long as you possibly can, to give your kids a chance to develop the skills and the interests and the interpersonal abilities that they need to succeed in the world. And I think that that's going to matter more and more in an AI-dominated world, that it is the skills that set us apart from the machines and that make us human that are going to help our kids succeed more than the kids who have just handed all of that over to the machines from a very young age and have not learned to differentiate themselves in any other kind of real human-like way.
Thank you. So I've gotten to ask lots of questions, so I'd like to now move to the audience, and we have time for the audience to ask questions, and I believe there are microphones.
Ooh, I got the mic first. Hi, my name is Vitek, and I'm a father of 2 kids. My wife and I are really enjoying the talk. I noticed in your presentation you had you talked about overprotection of kids in the real world, and something that really interested me is you had a point about if you reduce kids' screen time, replacing it, or basically giving them more freedom in real life. And I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I had a brother, this was probably about 30 years ago, we had a lot of freedom. Some of my best memories are going down to the corner store, which was quite a few blocks away, with just me and my brother. We would maybe buy those 1 or 2 cent candies. I don't know if you guys remember those. Or going to the park, and we would spend hours doing imaginative play, and those are some of the best memories of my life. And so what do you mean about giving kids more freedom?
Thanks for your question. I mean exactly that. I mean, if you can send your kid to the corner store to go pick up some milk or the newspaper, whatever it is that you need.
They would say that's illegal, right?
They would say it's illegal, and that's why we need more people doing it. Not to, I mean, yeah, so you should look at the Let Grow Foundation. LetGrow.org is a fantastic organization run by a woman named Lenore Skenazy, who is described as America's worst mom for letting her 10-year-old ride the New York City subway system all by himself. And she's pushed back on that. And she's basically become this outspoken proponent of giving kids more independence in the real world and needing to normalize the sight of children moving around our cities and our towns on their own without thinking that we just have to call the police. There have been some really high-profile cases, unfortunately, in certain states, primarily of police getting called because a mother has left her child unattended at age 10 or 11 or whatever it may be. And that's really not fair. We do need to fight back against that because it shouldn't be the law telling us when our child is actually capable of doing something. We retain that right as a parent. We really should. And there's a lot of movement in the States, and Lenore Skenazy's foundation is working to change, to pass these reasonable independence childhood laws so that parents can't actually be charged with letting kids do something that they have deemed their kid capable of doing. So we're not as bad in Canada, actually. In Ontario, though, I'm not supposed to let my kids be alone up until the age of 16, even though they can babysit at the age of 12. So I'm not quite sure. There's a lot of inconsistency in these laws. But basically, yeah, teach your kid how to, go through the world on their own. Start with taking them to the grocery store and have them go to the next aisle over and get an ingredient that you need. Have them walk to the post office to get the mail. I started teaching my kids to walk to school from a young age. We would go together, and I'd say, you tell me when it's safe to cross the street. Like, you're going to be the leader. So that over time, I felt confident in their ability to move on their own. There's strength in numbers. If you have multiple kids, to send them out in the world together will reassure you as a parent. If you can find a community, if you can find friends, neighbors, other parents who are willing to let their kids go as well, that can boost your own confidence. The best thing is seeing your child be capable in the world, because that's just going to make you feel even better and better, and then they'll become better and better. And it's just this wonderful positive feedback loop that happens. So that's I think the way to start. I lost my next thought, but yeah, it's a work in progress, and it's hard. I think as parents, our instinct is to protect. Oh, I was going to say, in urban settings, there's these Let Grow play clubs that are being created, which are before and after school programs that are sort of loosely administered by the school, but it's a place to send your child to just play freely with other kids of mixed ages in a sort of semi-supervised setting, not held to the same rules of recess, but the kids can just play, and it's screen-free as well. So in urban settings where you do not feel like it's safe to let your child play outside, if there's too much traffic or it's a neighborhood that's just not safe, if you can create sort of a Let Grow Play club or some kind of community space where kids can go to play freely, it can be really beneficial for them as well.
One thing I wanted to add to that, I think our number one job as parents is to protect our children. First keep them alive and then protect them from harm. But we have this misplaced sense of what they need to be protected from. I was chatting with Chris, the videographer here, just before we got started, and he said, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Chris, that he'd rather have his kids out playing in the park unsupervised for an hour than on a digital device for an hour. The risks of them playing outside, yes, of course there are some risks out there, but the risks that they're going to be exposed to unsupervised on a digital device, unsupervised for an hour is far greater at this point in time, and that's just the reality. And I know this from having worked in child protection for 3 decades now. I've worked, in child protection systems in Alberta and in Ontario. I used to run what's now known as the Luna Child Advocacy Centre, which is the wraparound supports for any child who experiences the worst forms of abuse. I know the statistics, 2 in 3 kids in Canada experiences abuse before their 15th birthday. Like, that is an absolutely galling statistic. 2/3 of our children experiencing abuse before their 15th birthday. But that abuse is not happening by somebody driving a white van. It's by a coach or a teacher, or it's by a trusted adult within your child's life. For the main part, over 90% of the abusers are somebody you know and trust. But we're also, hearing, particularly from Calgary Police Services, our police chief was just speaking about this very recently, the real escalation of online violence against children and the intersection between what the kids are seeing online and what they're experiencing in their day-to-day lives. And so, as Katherine referenced earlier, the huge exposure of boys in particular to porn, the average age at which boys in particular are exposed to porn now is 8. So our kids are seeing this online, and then they're acting it out in their day-to-day lives with their peers or their siblings. And so we have to understand the real risks that our kids are facing. It's not playing in the park. It's not the person driving the white van. So be informed as parents about the real risks, and then supporting them, as you were speaking about, around this sense of responsibility and trusting their capabilities and letting them fail and learning by trial and failure and getting comfortable with that.
I just want to add one thing, that Let Grow Foundation has a printable license. It's a card. It's called the Free Range Kid License that you can print off and put your name. And it basically says, like, if someone stops your kid and says, does your parent know where you are? Or I'm going to call the police. It says, my parent knows that I'm allowed to be out on my own and trusts me to get home and all of this. So it kind of just reinforces that and changes that societal norm that kids should not be out on the street. They absolutely should. They belong in this world just as much as we do.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Anne. I'm working mainly with books, and then I try to, help children falling in love with books. And here we have a book ban. And then, so one time I went to a school, I presented a book. It's a beautiful story. It's about a girl who is in a boarding school, and then she experienced a lot of shame, and then at some point the illustrator makes a choice of showing that girl changing because she beat herself. So Calgary school board asked me to not present that book to the kids. I almost got kicked out of their roster artist. And in the same time, we are exposed to potentially kids who are watching porn at 8 years old. So I don't know to what extent Alberta is showing positive signs to help children kind of like navigate things, but I was wondering if there is a chance, for example, for a group of parents to create sort of like a pilot project where like, you know what, no more book bans in that school, but we are going to be cautious about actually what we show, what we present of the digital world. And particularly, you know, when I go to school, I usually, I cross the hallway, I walk on the hallway, and the first thing I see is like a YouTube video to present a content. And then 15 minutes later, the other thing that I see is like a video to make yoga movement. And then a little bit of like 10 minutes of experience. And then the other thing I see is just like computer, children playing on Minecraft. And it's like constant. So kids overall have hours and hours of screens, but the books are banned. So like, it's just like, it blows my mind. Like, and then I guess it's like, is there any way or scripts we can do to try to convince just one school to have a pilot project, and how can we make it a case so that other, maybe the school board would be, hey, that's interesting, it works. Like if you have a script, I'll take it and I will try to go for it.
I think coming back to this idea of, you know, like we, as parents, sometimes we feel so powerless, or as educators feeling totally powerless, but we are not powerless. We can make changes. You know, as much as I'm fighting for policy changes and system level change, you know, I also have a child who's going to a school, and so I'm in regular communication with his school principal and school administrators about like the policies on these things and how can we make these changes. And you know, it can be hard when I'm doing this alone, but there's power in numbers. Every school has some type of parent-teacher association or some kind of parental group, and there is a real rise up of parents right now who are, you know, deeply concerned about their concerns, you know, that are, whether it's provincially, how our government is sort of maybe focused on the wrong things, banning books as opposed to trying to regulate some of these, regulate AI or, set safety standards for the use of technology. So. You can, one lone voice, you can make a difference in contacting, you know, the school, speaking with the principal, but also there's power in numbers. And so uniting with other parents, speaking to parent councils, or finding other parents or educators who share those same values and speaking up and trying to, it's not easy. And we're all overwhelmed and trying to do many things. But this is a moment when we can really push for those meaningful changes. And yeah, on the issue of book bans, again, you know, speak to your MLA, contact the premier and say, like, we've lost the plot here. We're not focused on the right things. We've got to get back to the basics of what our kids need to survive and thrive.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you so much for everything that you're sharing and everything you're doing. My name is Angie. I have 3 teenage sons, and they're 50% at my house and 50% at their father's house. They all have flip phones, and I really try to do all of these things, but they do get way too much screen time. And I'm just curious, I know what I'm going to go home and have the conversations and all the things that I'm going to do, but what is your advice or thoughts on when you have that second household who's ran by someone else who has different thoughts and not willing to have the same, as you know, as parents, wars that sometimes we have to have?
I've certainly heard that question quite often. You can't control what happens in the other house. I would hope that the relationship is amicable enough that you can try to have that conversation with your children's father, and by all means try to. But even if you can't, if things are being run completely differently over there and you really don't like it, there's nothing you can do about it. But what you control is your own home, and you can do a whole world of good for your kids by offering them that time and that space to be off of their devices as much as you possibly can. So it's not lost. You know, I have a friend whose daughter has come back from their dad's place, and it takes them, she said, 2 or 3 days to come down from just the elevated high of being on their tablets as much as they are when they're at his house. But she's committed to it. She weathers that storm. She gets them down. Their, emotional baseline kind of recalibrates for a few days, and then they go back again. And it's really hard. But know that whatever efforts you're making certainly certainly are worthwhile. There are some extreme cases I've heard about where a parent will involve a family doctor to actually write a prescription to, serve it to the other parent and say, our kid needs to not be on screens for this many hours a day in order to be able to flourish more. So I don't know if your situation would call for that. I've heard of it before, but there are some workarounds in that sense. So good luck. Know that you're doing good work.
Can I add something? Just more general parenting in the digital world, probably not direct to your question, but it's relevant, is something we found in the work is that sometimes it's not the screen time itself that hurts, but it's actually the parent's guilt and the stress triggered by that guilty actually harm the long-term parent-child relationship. I feel like in this kind of world, we have a lot, as we talked today, too much on parents, like how they model and how they should join media, co-viewing, and all the things the parents' own screen time impact children. So there's a lot, but the real world sometimes it's really messy. I'm parents of a toddler, so sometimes I just need half an hour, to put the dinner on the table, and I was stretched so thin, and at the same time I feel guilty while my son is still tugging and fussing. For screen media, I will say that half an hour, give them a high quality educational, and then that's it. It's not field parenting. This is little. It could be different for older children. But my point is, I think the parents should be gentle to themselves first, and then think about how to, support the children.
Thank you. That seems like a wonderful comment to end on. And I'm going to turn over the podium here to Stacey Penny to close us off. And I really want to thank the panel for their wonderful, thoughtful, and wise comments today.